What would you do if the person who destroyed your world came back seeking forgiveness? This is the story of Elena Ward in The Widow's Light, a journey of faith, pain, and the power of true grace. The wind carried the scent of smoke long before the flames appeared. It drifted through the valley like a whisper of warning, dry, bitter, familiar. Elena Ward stood by the window, her hands trembling against the wooden frame, her eyes locked on the horizon that glowed a sickening orange. She had seen fires before, but not like this. Not the kind that swallowed entire lives whole. Her husband, Daniel, had left that morning to deliver medicine to the neighboring village. "I'll be home before dusk," he'd said, his voice steady as always. He had kissed her forehead, smiled at the faint scent of lavender in her hair, and told her to keep the lamp by the window burning, their little tradition whenever one of them traveled at night. The lamp was their promise, a sign that no matter what happened, there was light waiting to guide them home. Now, dusk had come and gone, and the lamp burned alone. Outside, the air crackled with fear. The villagers ran past her door, women clutching children, men shouting warnings she couldn't understand. Somewhere down the road, she heard the roar of engines, then the sharp, chaotic bursts of gunfire. Soldiers. They had come again. Elena's heart pounded as she reached for the small wooden cross that hung around her neck. It was smooth from years of prayer, warm from the touch of her hand. "Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please, please, bring him back." The ground shuddered as an explosion ripped through the distance. The lights flickered. Somewhere a scream echoed through the night, a sound that sliced through her soul like glass. She dropped to her knees beside the window, tears spilling freely now. Minutes or hours passed in chaos. The night blurred into fragments of fire and smoke. Her home shook with each blast until a sudden crash threw her backward. The front door splintered inward. Men stormed in, shouting in a language of anger and authority. Their faces were hidden behind masks and shadows. One grabbed her by the arm, pushing her aside as they overturned furniture, searching for something. Food, valuables, fear. She didn't scream. She prayed. "Father, forgive them," she whispered, barely breathing the words. "They don't know what they're doing." One soldier stopped mid-step, turning toward her as if hearing something strange in her tone. His eyes, cold, sharp, met hers for a fleeting second. Then he shoved her aside and barked an order to his men. Moments later, they were gone. The sound of their boots faded into the night. When silence returned, it came heavy and merciless. The room was a ruin. The small table Daniel had built with his own hands lay shattered. The wedding photograph, their only one, had fallen face down, the glass cracked like a spider's web. Outside, the world glowed red. The sky itself seemed to burn. Elena stumbled out into the road. The air stung her eyes. Ashes fell like dark snow. Her neighbors' homes were gone, blackened frames where laughter had once lived. She called Daniel's name, her voice hoarse, but the wind swallowed it whole. Down the slope, near the old church, she saw the outline of a figure in the firelight. Her heart leapt. "Daniel!" she cried, running forward. But as she neared, her steps slowed. The man was not moving. She fell to her knees beside him. His face was pale beneath the soot, his eyes closed, his body still. The world went silent. No wind, no fire, no sound but her heart breaking. She touched his hand. It was cold, too cold. Elena's cry tore through the burning night. She clung to him, whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. "You promised you'd come home," she said, her voice barely audible. You promised." When the flames died at last, dawn crept in with cruel gentleness. The soldiers were gone. The village was unrecognizable, a graveyard of smoke and ruin. Elena sat beside her husband's body until the sun broke through the haze, golden and unfeeling. Then she rose. Her eyes were swollen, her clothes torn, but something in her heart refused to die. She carried Daniel's body to the small church that still stood at the edge of town. Its windows were shattered, its cross charred, yet the altar remained, the one place untouched by destruction. There, she laid him down. Her hands shook as she lit a single candle beside his body. She watched its flame tremble, small but unyielding, refusing to go out despite the drafts whispering through the broken walls. "Elena Ward," she whispered to herself, as if saying her name could remind her she was still alive. "You will not let the darkness win." She looked at the candle, that fragile, flickering light, and thought of the lamp by the window still burning in her home, a symbol of hope, a promise. "I will keep your light, Daniel, even if the world burns again." Then she knelt, folded her hands, and prayed, not for herself, not for revenge, but for the men who had done this, for the ones who had taken everything. "Lord," she said through tears, "forgive them, show them mercy, lead them out of this darkness, the same way you lead me now." And in that quiet ruin, surrounded by the ashes of yesterday, the first miracle began. A widow's prayer rising from the smoke, unseen yet heard by heaven. The days that followed were not counted in hours, but in silences. Each dawn felt like a continuation of the same endless night. Elena Ward woke each morning to the sound of crows and the wind sweeping through the hollowed remains of her village, reminders of what had been lost. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. Charred wood, scorched metal, and the ghostly perfume of burnt earth lingered everywhere. Yet in the midst of ruin, there was one small thing that remained untouched: the lantern on her windowsill. It was the same one she had lit for Daniel the night he left. Somehow, through the chaos, through the fire and ash, it still stood. The glass was cracked, the metal blackened, but inside, a small flame still flickered stubbornly. When Elena saw it, her breath caught in her chest. She walked to it slowly, afraid that even a whisper of movement might snuff it out. But the flame held. It trembled gently, as if greeting her, as if reminding her that promises, once made in love, were not so easily destroyed. She fell to her knees before it, tears slipping down her face. "You're still here. You kept burning." That night, as the sun sank behind the ruined hills, she found herself drawn to her husband's old writing desk. The top was scorched, and half of the drawers were broken, but in one, untouched, she found his small notebook and a letter sealed in brown paper. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was Daniel's, strong, careful, familiar. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, then I am already home. Not the one we built, but the one we always spoke of. Please don't weep too long for me, my love. You always said that light cannot fear the dark. It only shines brighter when the night is deepest. Keep the lantern burning, not for me, but for whoever is still searching for their way home. Forgive them, Elena. All of them. The men who hate us, the ones who mock our faith, forgive them as Christ forgave his own. One act of mercy can ripple further than we'll ever know. You were always the gentlest soul I knew. Be the proof that love does not die with the body. Be the light they cannot destroy. Until we meet again, Daniel." Elena pressed the letter to her heart, and closed her eyes. She could almost hear his voice again, calm, kind, unbroken. The words felt like both a command and a comfort, like a bridge between two worlds, the one she'd lost and the one she was still meant to build. The next morning, she carried the lantern down the road to what remained of the old chapel. The priest had fled weeks ago. The building stood empty, a shell of faith. But inside, the sunlight streamed through shattered windows, catching on dust and broken glass, until the air glittered with gold. She set the lantern on the altar. "This light," she whispered, "will never go out. Not while I still breathe." At first, people thought she was mad. Survivors from nearby towns passed through the ruins, scavenging for supplies. When they saw her kneeling in the church, praying beside the flickering light, they scoffed. "Still praying," one man laughed bitterly. "The world burned and God didn't lift a finger." Elena met his gaze quietly. "He wept with us," she said. "And he still hears." They shook their heads and moved on, yet she prayed for them all the same. Each night, she lit the lantern again. Each dawn, she opened the church doors for anyone who wished to sit in silence. Most passed by without entering, but slowly, very slowly, a few began to come. A wounded boy with bandages around his head, an elderly woman searching for her missing daughter, a soldier deserter, too ashamed to go home. They came not for sermons, but for silence, and for the strange peace that seemed to fill the church whenever the lantern's flame glowed against the walls. Elena never preached. She simply listened, prayed, and offered warmth. A bowl of soup, a kind word, a candle lit in memory of someone lost. The mocking stopped, replaced by whispers of wonder. One night, a young man appeared at the door. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with grime, and when he stepped into the dim light, Elena saw the insignia on his shoulder, the same worn by the soldiers who had burned the village. Her breath caught. Every part of her wanted to recoil, but Daniel's letter echoed in her mind. "Forgive them, Elena." He stood uncertainly near the entrance, avoiding her eyes. "I heard," his voice cracked, "I heard there was light here, that someone prayed for us, even for men like me." Elena said nothing for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "You heard right." The young man sank to his knees, trembling. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you pray for monsters?" Her answer was soft, steady. "Because we all need saving, even those who break what they cannot understand." He covered his face with his hands and wept, the kind of weeping that shakes the soul loose from its armor. Elena knelt beside him and placed the lantern between them. Its glow reflected in his tears. "Light doesn't ask where the darkness comes from. It just shines," she quietly said. That night, she prayed not only for the man, but for all who had lost their way. For every enemy, every stranger, every soul wandering blind through the ruins of their own choices. And as she prayed, the wind outside stilled, the smoke in the air lifted slightly, and the stars appeared over the broken steeple, bright, clear, unashamed to shine. The world was still scarred, the pain was still real, but for the first time since that night of fire, hope stirred again, faint yet alive. In the heart of a shattered village, one widow's light burned on. The days began to stretch again. No longer endless nights of mourning, but slow dawns heavy with the ache of rebuilding. The war had moved east, leaving behind a trail of hollow homes and hollow hearts. Yet in the center of the ruins, a single place still breathed, the chapel, where a widow kept a flame alive. Every morning, Elena Ward swept the church floor. Her broom gathered more ashes than dust, but she never complained. To her, the ashes were not reminders of death, they were reminders of what had survived. The roof was still partly intact, the altar still stood, and in the corner of the sanctuary, the lantern still burned, faint but steady. She spoke to it sometimes, the way one might speak to a memory. "You and I were stubborn," she'd say with a faint smile, "and that's a blessing, I suppose." Outside, the village was learning to breathe again. People began to return, not many at first. A handful of families rebuilt what they could from the rubble. The blacksmith set up a forge under an open sky. The baker used a broken chimney as his oven. The old teacher started gathering children under a fallen tree to read from books too charred to close. And every evening, when the sun dipped low, the faint glow of the lantern shone through the chapel's cracked window, casting long rays of light across the street. People began to notice it, not just as a strange relic of the past, but as a quiet promise that the world could still hold warmth. They started calling it the widow's light. It wasn't meant kindly at first. Some said it mockingly, half in jest, as if the woman who prayed for her enemies was a fool who couldn't face the truth. But others began to whisper the name with wonder, softly, reverently, as though it carried something sacred. Rumors spread in small, trembling circles that the sick found peace when they sat by her lantern, that the nightmares of the children stopped when she prayed, that the man who had once been an enemy soldier, the one she forgave, had left the village and joined a group helping rebuild other towns. No one could prove these things, but whispers have a way of carrying hope faster than truth can walk. Elena never sought recognition. She simply continued her quiet routine, sweeping, tending the lantern, praying for those who came. When food was scarce, she shared what little she had. When someone wept, she listened. When no one came, she prayed harder. One afternoon, as she sat near the altar, a group of young men entered the chapel. They weren't the gentle kind. Their laughter was sharp, their words filled with restless bitterness. War had stolen their fathers, and faith had stolen their patience. "So this is the famous light, the one that's supposed to make everything better?" Another kicked over a chair. "Where was this light when the soldiers came?" Elena didn't rise. She simply looked up at them, her gaze calm, her hands folded in her lap. "The light was there," she said quietly, "even when the smoke covered it. It never left." The man smirked. "And where was your God? Sleeping?" The question was cruel, but his eyes held something deeper, a wound he was too proud to show. Elena stood slowly, her movements unhurried. She walked to the lantern and placed her hand on the warm glass. "He was here," she said, "right here, in every person who chose to love instead of hate. In every moment someone held on when it would have been easier to let go. He was there, just as he's here now." Silence followed. The mockery faltered. The men shifted uneasily. For a moment it seemed as though one of them might speak, but then they turned and left. Their laughter resumed outside, forced and hollow. When the door closed, Elena's shoulders trembled. She sank to her knees and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for them. "Father, forgive their anger. It's born from pain. Soften them, Lord. Soften them the way you softened me." As she prayed, the evening sun poured through the cracked window, striking the lantern's glass and scattering golden light across the floor. The beams shimmered like water, flowing over the walls, the altar, her folded hands. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Drawn by the commotion, or perhaps by curiosity, they watched through the open doorway as the light filled the church, bathing Elena in a glow that seemed almost otherworldly. "She's still praying," someone whispered. "For them?" another asked. "For all of us," came a quiet reply. That night, a gentle rain fell for the first time in months. The flames of war had scorched the earth, leaving it barren, but the rain washed through the cracks, cooling the stones, softening the air. When the people awoke the next morning, they found the lantern still burning, and in the small garden behind the church, tiny green shoots pushing through the ash. The children called them resurrection flowers. Elena smiled when she saw them. "New life from ruin," she whispered, touching the tender leaves. "Just as he promised." Word spread again, faster this time. Whispers in the ruins of rain, of flowers, of hope, carried from one household to another. For the first time since the fires, laughter returned to the village. Fragile, tentative, but real. And in the center of it all, the widow's light kept shining. Not bright enough to blind, but strong enough to guide the lost. By the time spring brushed color back into the hills, the village had almost learned to breathe again. Smoke no longer lingered over the rooftops. The sound of hammering replaced the echo of gunfire, and laughter, faint and hesitant, began to weave its way through the market square. But peace, Elena knew, was fragile. It trembled like the flame of her lantern, beautiful, but always one harsh wind away from vanishing. She rose each morning before the sun, her daily ritual unchanged. Sweep the chapel floor, light the lantern, pray. Every word she spoke felt less like asking and more like surrendering, letting God shape what she could not understand. That morning the sky was pale gold, and the air smelled of rain on dust. As she opened the chapel doors, she saw a figure standing near the village gate. He was tall, his posture stooped slightly as though the world had pressed down on him too long. His coat was worn, his boots caked in dried mud. Even from a distance, she saw how he hesitated, one hand resting on the gate post, his head bowed as if uncertain whether to enter. Something in her chest tightened. Travelers were not unusual these days. Soldiers passing through, refugees seeking shelter, merchants trying to rebuild their roots. But this man carried an air of exhaustion beyond mere hunger or fatigue. She watched him for a long time before walking down the dirt path toward him. "Good morning," she said softly. The man turned slowly. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but when he looked up, she saw eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, a gray-blue dull from too much seeing. "Good morning," he replied, his voice rough, the words deliberate, as though he had not spoken in days. "You're welcome to come in," Elena said. "The village has food and a place to rest if you need it." He hesitated. "I don't know if I'm welcome anywhere." She tilted her head. "You are now." He said nothing, only nodded slightly and followed her toward the chapel. His steps were slow, uneven. When they reached the courtyard, he paused, staring at the blackened walls and the lantern flickering faintly in the window. "That light," he murmured. "It's been burning for months, hasn't it?" "Yes," Elena said. "It hasn't gone out since the night everything burned." He turned to her, studying her face carefully. "And you're the one they call the widow." There was no cruelty in his tone, only a quiet recognition, as though the title carried weight he understood. Elena didn't flinch. "That's what they call me," she said simply. He nodded once. "I've heard of you, even beyond these hills. Some say you pray for your enemies. Some say your light never fades. Some say you're—" He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. "Well, people say many things." She smiled faintly. "People always will." They stepped into the chapel. The man looked around, his gaze tracing the cracked walls, the altar scarred with fire, the rows of uneven pews. When his eyes fell on the lantern, his expression changed. Something raw flickered across his face. "Does it ever go out?" he asked. "No," Elena said. "Not as long as I'm here to tend to it." He nodded, but his hands clenched slightly at his sides. He seemed to be holding something. Guilt? Grief? Perhaps both? "Would you like to pray?" she asked gently. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Pray?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am. I don't think there's a prayer left in me that heaven would want to hear." "Then I'll pray for you," Elena said softly. He looked up sharply, startled. "Why?" "Because someone once prayed for me when I didn't deserve it either." The man's eyes softened, then hardened again, as though struggling against some unseen battle. He turned toward the doorway. "I should go." "You don't have to," Elena said quietly. But he was already stepping into the light. Before he crossed the threshold, he paused, his voice barely audible. "If you knew who I was, you wouldn't want me here." And then he was gone. Elena stood in the doorway long after his figure disappeared down the road. The morning breeze stirred her hair. A strange unease settled over her. Not fear exactly, but a whisper of recognition she couldn't place. That evening, as she lit the lantern, she found a folded scrap of paper on the chapel step. It was damp from the mist, the handwriting uneven. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." No name, no signature, only that. She held the note over the lantern flame, watching the light flicker through the thin paper, and though she didn't know who the stranger was or what guilt he carried, she whispered, "You are forgiven, whoever you are." Outside, the wind rose, rustling the trees along the road. Somewhere beyond the gate, the stranger stopped walking and looked back toward the distant glow of the lantern. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he breathed a prayer, not in words, but in longing. And that night, as Elena knelt before the altar, the flame of the lantern danced higher than usual, as if reaching for something unseen. And far away, under the same stars, a man who once believed himself beyond mercy felt, for the briefest moment, that grace might still find him. The morning after the stranger's visit was quieter than usual, unnaturally so, as though the whole village was holding its breath. The fog lay heavy on the hills, softening every shape and sound. Elena stood by the chapel door, her hands resting on the old wooden frame. The note, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," still lingered in her mind, haunting her with unanswered questions. Who was he? What was he sorry for? And why had his eyes carried such unbearable sorrow? She told herself she shouldn't dwell on it, but as the day passed, every sound, a footstep in the street, a creak of the gate, made her turn, half expecting to see him again. When dusk came, she baked bread as she always did, the ritual she had never abandoned since the war ended. She kneaded the dough slowly, praying with every motion, "Lord, let whoever walks through that door tonight find peace." By the time the loaf had risen, the fog had thickened again, curling around the chapel like a veil. She placed the bread on the altar beside the lantern, its glow soft and steady. Then, a sound. a quiet knock at the door. Her heart stilled. When she opened it, the same stranger stood there. His clothes were damp from the mist, and he looked thinner than before, his shoulders bowed. I didn't mean to intrude again, but I couldn't leave things as they are. Elena studied him, then stepped aside. "Come in. There's warmth and bread." He hesitated for a heartbeat, then entered. The smell of baked bread filled the small chapel, mingling with the scent of rain and smoke from the old candle stubs. For a long while, neither spoke. He stood staring at the lantern flame while Elena sliced the bread, her movements calm but deliberate. Finally, she said quietly, "You said I wouldn't want you here if I knew who you were. Why?" The man's jaw tightened. "Because I was here the night this village burned." Elena froze, the knife hovering above the loaf. He continued, voice shaking. "I was a soldier, one of the men who carried out the orders. We were told the town was harboring rebels. It wasn't true. But by the time we realized, it was too late. I lit one of the torches. The silence that followed felt like it could break the world in half." Elena slowly set the knife down, her eyes never leaving his face. "And you came back? Now? Why?" "Because every night since, I've seen the fire in my dreams. I thought if I could find the place, if I could see what was left, maybe I could ask forgiveness. But seeing you here, the widow they talk about, I didn't know how to face you." He lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know." Elena's breath trembled. Her mind reeled with memories she had buried. The screams, the burning sky, the shadow of soldiers through smoke. And now one of them stood before her. Her first instinct was to turn away, to let the pain rise, to give it voice, to finally name the face of the man who had taken everything. But as her eyes fell on the lantern flame, flickering soft and unwavering, another memory came. Her husband's words, spoken in their last morning together. "If darkness comes for me, promise you'll keep the light burning, not for revenge, but for grace." Her lips parted, trembling. "You destroyed what I loved most," she whispered. "I know, and I'll live with that until the day I die." Elena closed her eyes, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "And yet," she said, her voice breaking, "I cannot live with hate anymore." When she looked at him again, her face was pale, but calm. She took the bread, still warm, and broke it in two. She handed him a piece. "This bread was meant for those who hunger, and you are starving for peace. Take it." The man stared at her, disbelief flooding his eyes. "You would share your table with me after what I've done?" "Because Christ shared his table with those who betrayed him, and because I am still learning what it means to forgive." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, trembling, he reached out and took the bread. His fingers brushed hers, rough, scarred, human. As he ate, tears streaked down his face. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "None of us do." They sat there in silence, the widow and the soldier, two souls bound by fire and grace, sharing the same bread under the same unwavering light. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "What should I do now?" he asked quietly. Elena looked at him, her eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "Go live differently," she said. "Let your repentance be the fire that warms, not destroys." He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "I will." And as he walked out into the mist, the lantern flame behind him flared brighter, as though heaven itself had leaned closer to watch. That night, Elena knelt before the altar once more. "Lord," she whispered, "thank you for teaching me that forgiveness is not forgetting, it's freeing." Outside, the fog lifted. A single star appeared over the chapel roof, gleaming faintly, like the echo of a promise kept. The news spread faster than the morning wind. By dawn, every corner of the village whispered the same unthinkable truth. The widow had forgiven one of the men who burned their homes. Elena did not have to hear it to know. She felt it, in the way conversations stopped when she passed, in the tight smiles, the averted eyes. Forgiveness, she had learned, was rarely applauded. By mid-morning, 2 of the elders came to the chapel. Their faces were lined with the same grief she carried, but their eyes held accusation too, the kind born from wounds that still bled. "Is it true?" one asked, voice still but sharp. "You broke bread with him?" Elena stood behind the altar, her hands folded. "Yes." The other elder's voice trembled. "That man destroyed our lives. He took our sons. He burned your husband alive, Elena. And you shared your table with him?" Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "I did." "Then what are we to make of justice?" the first elder demanded. "If forgiveness is so easily given, what meaning does loss have? What does it say to the dead?" Elena's voice was quiet, but unshaken. "It says that evil did not win, that even fire cannot consume grace." The words hung in the air, bold, fragile, dangerous. The elder shook his head, grief and anger mingling in his eyes. "Your mercy dishonors their memory." "No," Elena said softly. "It redeems it." They left without another word. When the chapel door closed, Elena's strength faltered. She sank to her knees beside the altar, trembling. She had done what she believed was right, yet now the weight of it pressed against her like stone. "Lord, why does obedience feel like exile?" The lantern flame flickered, as if an answer. That evening, as the sky turned the color of ashes, Elena walked to the fields behind the chapel, the same fields her husband once tended. The soil was scarred, still blackened from the fire, yet as she knelt and touched the earth, she noticed something, faint green shoots pushing through the dark crust. Seeds, long buried, had survived. She smiled through her tears. "Even after fire," she murmured, "life remembers how to rise." Days passed. The stranger, whose name she now knew as Daniel, had not returned, but word came from nearby villages that a lone traveler was rebuilding burned homes, leaving food at doors, working quietly before moving on. Each story carried the same detail: a man who never gave his name, a man who never accepted payment, a man who said only, "I once destroyed what I now rebuild." Every time she heard, she lit the lantern anew and prayed for him. But not everyone prayed. One night, stones struck the chapel windows. Voices rose from the dark. "Traitor! Sympathizer! How can you forgive the men who killed our children?" The shouts cut deep, sharper than the stones themselves. Elena didn't open the door. She simply knelt inside, the glow of the lantern brushing her face. Her hands trembled as she prayed, not for protection, but for peace. "Father, forgive them," she whispered through tears. "They're angry because they still bleed. Teach me not to return pain for pain." Outside, the shouting faded. The wind took their anger, scattering it among the trees. In the silence that followed, she heard something else, a soft rustle near the door. When she opened it, no one was there. Only a small sack rested on the step. Inside were handfuls of grain, enough to feed the poor for a week. Tied to it was a piece of paper. "The ashes are fertile. Keep planting. D." Elena pressed the note to her chest, tears falling freely. She looked out over the night, at the dark horizon where the hills met the stars, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for reminding me grace multiplies when planted in pain." The next morning, she walked out to the charred fields and scattered the grain with her bare hands, one handful at a time. And as the seeds fell, the lantern flame glowed brighter in the chapel window, a promise that what is sown in tears will one day bloom in joy. That night, A quiet peace settled over the village. The same villagers who had cursed her now watched from their windows as the widow planted in the ashes, her lantern beside her. Its light, steady, unmoving, eternal. And far away, in a small town beyond the hills, a weary man knelt beside a broken wall and whispered, "Forgiveness is a seed. Lord, let it grow." Summer arrived like a sigh of relief. The hills turned green again, and the earth, once blackened, began to bloom. From the chapel steps, Elena watched as life crept back into the valley. The trees heavy with fruit, children's laughter chasing away the ghosts that had lingered too long. And yet, deep down, she knew peace was still incomplete. Forgiveness might begin in one heart, but it must travel from one soul to another before it can heal a people. She still thought of Daniel. Every night, she prayed for him, not because she understood him, but because grace had knit their stories together in ways neither could undo. One afternoon, as she tended the small field behind the chapel, she heard footsteps crunching on the path. She turned, brushing soil from her hands, and froze. Daniel stood a few paces away. His beard was thicker now, his skin roughened by sun and labor. His clothes were still plain, but his eyes, they were different. Lighter somehow. Not free, but no longer imprisoned by guilt alone. He carried a sack over his shoulder and something wrapped in cloth. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see this place again," he said quietly. Elena smiled faintly. "And yet, you found your way back." He lowered the sack, unwrapping the bundle carefully. Inside was a loaf of bread, uneven, golden brown, imperfectly baked. He said, "I learned. It isn't as good as yours, but I tried. I thought it right to return what was once given in mercy." Elena took the bread, her eyes soft. "It's perfect," she whispered. They stood in silence for a long time, the afternoon sun falling through the chapel windows, dust motes drifting like tiny stars. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I've been rebuilding. Homes, fences, wells. People are still afraid to look at me, but I understand. I deserve their silence." Elena shook her head gently. "Deserve has nothing to do with grace." He looked down. "Then how do I live with what I've done?" "By letting love do what hate never could. By sowing peace where you once sowed pain. You've already begun." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Do you ever stop feeling the weight of it?" Elena's gaze drifted toward the fields. "The weight doesn't go away," she said softly. "It changes. It becomes the reason you walk gentler, the reason you listen deeper, the reason you forgive again." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think I understand." Then, from the road, they heard shouts, not angry this time, but urgent. Villagers were running toward the fields, pointing to the horizon. Smoke. A farmhouse on the outskirts had caught fire, the wind driving the flames fast toward the crops. Without a word, Daniel dropped his sack and ran. Elena followed. By the time they reached the house, chaos had taken hold. Villagers shouting, water sloshing from buckets, children crying. And at the center of it all, Daniel plunged straight into the smoke, pulling a trapped boy from the doorway. The villagers froze when they saw him. Recognition flickered in their faces. Fear, confusion, anger. But then one woman, the boy's mother, fell to her knees sobbing. "He saved my son." Daniel stumbled out of the smoke, coughing, soot streaked across his face. His arms were burned, his clothes torn, but the boy in his arms was alive. Elena ran to them, her heart hammering. "Daniel!" He smiled weakly, setting the child down. "Guess it was my turn to give something back." The villagers gathered slowly, their faces changing, suspicion softening into awe, anger into shame. One of the elders, the same who had condemned Elena weeks before, stepped forward. His voice shook. "We misjudged you." Daniel shook his head. "No, you judged rightly, but God, He showed mercy." The elder bowed his head. "Then perhaps we should learn from Him." And for the first time, Someone from the crowd reached out and touched Daniel's shoulder, not in accusation, but in thanks. Tears welled in Elena's eyes as she watched the scene unfold. The field behind them was scorched, but not destroyed. The fire had stopped at the edge, where new green shoots had begun to grow. Ashes and seeds. Lord, you never waste either. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the villagers gathered outside the chapel. They brought bread, water, fruit, and flowers. Elena placed Daniel's imperfect loaf at the center of the altar. This, she said, her voice steady, is what grace looks like when it grows. Daniel bowed his head, his voice a whisper. Thank you, Lord, for not leaving me in the fire I lit. And for the first time in years, laughter, pure, unguarded, human, rose from the chapel like music. The lantern burned beside them, brighter than ever, reflecting in their faces the widow, the soldier, and the people who had learned together that mercy, once planted, can harvest miracles. That night, as the stars filled the sky, Elena stepped outside alone. The hills shimmered under the silver moonlight, peaceful at last. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Forgiveness is not the end of the story, Lord. It's the beginning of everything new." And far across the valley, unseen but deeply felt, the lantern's light stretched, not as a symbol of mourning anymore, but as a living testimony. Grace always finds its way home. The sky broke open without warning. By dusk, black clouds had swallowed the horizon, and thunder rolled like the echo of distant drums. The villagers hurried to shutter their windows, to pull their children inside. Wind swept through the valley, rattling the chapel's old bell until it wailed across the hills. Elena stood at the doorway, the lantern flame trembling behind her. Rain struck the roof like fists. The storm was fierce, sudden, relentless, and wild. Inside, Daniel helped move the benches from the flooding floor. His arms, still scarred from the fire, moved with quiet strength. "This storm feels alive," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "It's only rain," though even she didn't believe it. There was something in this storm, something deeper, older, almost spiritual. Then came the cry. A woman burst through the chapel doors, drenched and trembling. "The river," she gasped. "It's rising. The bridge is gone. The Carter boys trapped on the far side." Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his coat. "Where?" Elena caught his arm. "Daniel, the river's too high. It's not safe." He met her eyes, calm but resolute. "Neither was the fire, but I can't stand by again." Before she could stop him, he was gone. Running into the storm, his figure swallowed by darkness. Elena's heart clenched. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley below. She could see the river, swollen and furious, devouring its banks. Somewhere in that chaos, Daniel fought against the current, a lone figure moving toward danger. She fell to her knees. "Lord," she whispered, "guide him. Don't let the darkness take him again." The storm raged for hours. Inside the chapel, the villagers huddled together, praying out loud as the wind howled around them. Water seeped through the cracks. The lantern flickered wildly. Once, twice, then dimmed. Elena clutched it to her chest. "No," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Not the light. Not now." She shielded it with her hands, whispering through tears. "You've burned through fire, through loss, burned through this too." And somehow, impossibly, the flames steadied again. By midnight, the rain began to slow. The wind softened to a sigh. The thunder moved off into the hills. Elena rose, heart pounding. "I have to find him." Several villagers followed her with torches, their faces pale but determined. The path was slippery, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. When they reached the riverbank, the bridge was gone, a skeleton of wood and rope scattered downstream. But across the torrent, under a collapsed tree, they saw a faint movement. "Daniel!" Elena shouted. No answer. She waded in, ignoring the hands that tried to stop her. The cold bit into her skin, but she pressed on, praying with every step. Please, Lord, let him live. Don't let the mercy end in tragedy. Then, a cough, a gasp. He was there, half submerged, holding the Carter boy above the water with one arm. The child clung to him, sobbing. Elena reached them just as others pulled them from the river. Daniel collapsed to the ground, shivering, his breath ragged. The child was safe. Elena knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she brushed wet hair from his forehead. "You found him," she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly through trembling lips. "No, he found me first." His gaze lifted past her toward the chapel on the hill, where the lantern still burned faintly in the window. "That light," he said, voice breaking. "It never gave up." "Neither did you," she replied, tears mixing with rain. They carried him back to the chapel. The villagers gathered close, wrapping him in blankets, tending his wounds. For hours, Elena sat beside him as he drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring prayers through fevered breaths. When dawn finally came, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the valley. Daniel stirred, eyes opening slowly. "Is it morning?" "It is," Elena said softly. "You made it." He smiled weakly. "Then maybe the storm wasn't meant to destroy. Maybe it was meant to cleanse." Elena took his hand. "The same God who allows the flood is the one who plants the rainbow." Outside, as if on cue, light broke across the retreating clouds, a wide arc of color stretching over the valley. The villagers stood in silence, awe written across their faces. For the first time, they didn't see Daniel as the soldier who once destroyed their homes, but as the man who had risked his life to save one of their sons. Elena looked at the rainbow, then at the lantern still burning in the chapel window, and she knew. Every trial had been leading here, to this quiet revelation that faith doesn't keep storms away, it teaches hearts to endure them with love. That night, when peace finally returned to the valley, Elena wrote in her husband's old journal, "The storm came, and it did not break us. The light burned, and it did not fade. Mercy remains our only shelter, forgiveness our harvest, and love is the flame that no darkness can drown." The valley was green again. The air smelled of life, of tilled soil, rain-kissed grass, and the faint sweetness of new blossoms. The river that had once threatened to swallow the land now ran gentle and clear, a mirror of sky and promise. Weeks had passed since the storm, and Daniel had healed slowly under Elena's care. His burns faded to pale scars, his strength returning day by day. He spent his mornings repairing fences, planting crops with the villagers who had once feared him. Children followed him now, not out of curiosity, but affection, bringing him small flowers, calling him Mr. Dandel. Each evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, he would sit outside the chapel while Elena tended the lantern. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they sat in silence, the kind that spoke louder than words. It was peace, fragile, but real. And yet, in Daniel's eyes, there lingered a quiet unease. One night, as stars shimmered above the valley, he broke the silence. "Elena," he said softly, "I think my time here is ending." She looked up sharply. "Ending? Why?" He turned the small loaf of bread in his hands, a new habit of his when searching for words. He said, "I've been praying, and I keep hearing the same whisper. Go. Not because I'm running, but because others are still where I once was, drowning in guilt, buried in darkness. If grace can reach me here, it can reach them too." Elena's breath caught. She knew this moment would come, had even prayed for it, but her heart clenched all the same. "You've built something beautiful here. You've become part of the healing." He smiled faintly. "That's the thing about healing. It doesn't end where it starts. It moves, like the river after a storm." For a long moment, neither spoke. The lantern's flames swayed gently in the wind, its glow reflected in both their eyes. Finally, Elena said, "If this is where God is leading you, then you must go. But know this, you will always have a home here." Daniel nodded, his voice thick. "And I'll always carry this place in me. The widow who prayed for the man who burned her world, the lantern that refused to die." A soft laugh escaped her, tremulous but warm. "You make it sound holier than it was." "It was," he said simply, "because love like that isn't natural, it's divine." The next morning, the entire village gathered at the chapel steps. Daniel stood before them with a small pack and his walking staff. He looked almost like a pilgrim, humble, scarred, redeemed. One by one, the villagers came forward, pressing his hand, thanking him, blessing him. The same elder who had once condemned him handed him a loaf of bread. "Go with peace, son," the old man said softly. "You've taught us what mercy costs and what it gives." Daniel bowed his head, tears glinting in his eyes. Elena stepped forward last, carrying the lantern. She held it out to him. He shook his head. "It belongs here. It's your light." Elena smiled gently. "The flame does, but not the glass." She lifted the lantern lid, and with careful hands drew out a smaller wick she had prepared the night before, a second light, already burning. She placed it in his hands. "Take it," she whispered. "Wherever you go, let it remind you that grace travels too." Daniel stared at the tiny flame, fragile, warm, alive. He looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "You've given me more than forgiveness, Elena. You've given me a reason to live as a forgiven man." She smiled through tears. "Then go live it well." He left at sunrise. The road curved through the hills, golden in the morning light. Elena watched until his figure became a small, moving shadow and finally disappeared over the ridge. A hush fell over the valley, not empty, but sacred. She turned back toward the chapel. The old lantern still burned, steady as ever, its twin now traveling the world beyond. Inside, she knelt at the altar, whispering, "Lord, he goes in your name. Let his light reach the places mine never will." That night, as the village slept, a soft wind moved through the valley. The lantern's flame danced, and for a fleeting second, Elena imagined she saw another light flicker in the distance, faint, small, but moving steadily east. A light carrying grace across the darkened world. Far down the road, Daniel paused beneath the stars. He looked back toward the faint glow of the chapel, then lifted the small lantern he carried. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for bringing me home so you could send me out." And with that, he walked on. One man, one flame, one purpose. A living witness to the truth that forgiveness is not the end of the story, but the beginning of the kingdom.
The road wound downward into a quiet valley, framed by rolling fields and gentle streams. After days of walking, Daniel reached a small town called Lindenbrook, a place that seemed peaceful at first glance, yet carried a silence too heavy to be at rest. Smoke curled from chimneys. Shops were open, but the laughter that usually filled the air in small towns was absent. The faces he passed were weary, eyes shadowed with suspicion and grief. He soon learned why. A flood had struck Lindenbrook months before, destroying much of the lower quarter. The townspeople blamed one another, the council for inaction, the farmers upstream for neglecting the levees, even the church for not praying hard enough. Division had grown like a vine, choking the heart of the town. Daniel watched it quietly, recognizing the look in their eyes, the same anger that once burned in his own reflection. He found work easily, mending fences, fixing roofs, carrying supplies. His scars drew questions, but his gentleness disarmed curiosity before it turned to judgment. He rarely spoke of himself. When asked where he came from, he would smile faintly and say,
from a valley that was once broken, but healed. Each evening he lit his small lantern by his bedside and prayed, "Lord, let this light find the hearts that need it." Weeks passed. Slowly, he began to notice the smallest of changes. The widow on the corner, who hadn't spoken to anyone since the flood, began to leave loaves of bread on her windowsill. "Extras," she said with a shrug, though everyone knew she meant them for the hungry. The two farmers, who hadn't exchanged a word in months, found themselves working side by side, mending a shared fence that Daniel had quietly started repairing one morning without asking permission. At the chapel, the pastor, a man named Father Jonah, invited Daniel to help clean the grounds. Together they repaired the cracked steps and polished the old cross that leaned crookedly against the sky. One afternoon, as the sun fell golden on the fields, Father Jonah asked, "You have peace in you. Hard-won peace. How did you find it?" Daniel looked at the lantern he always kept by his side. "He didn't find it," he said softly. "It found me, through someone who refused to give up on light when everything around her was dark." Father Jonah smiled faintly. "Sounds like a saint." Daniel said, "She's just a widow, but her prayers reached me farther than her hands ever could." The following Sunday, Daniel attended service for the first time since his arrival. The chapel was half full, the congregation divided even in worship. When Father Jonah stood to preach, his words trembled with exhaustion. He said, "We ask for blessings, but we've forgotten how to forgive. How can a house divided hold the presence of God?" Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded, others looked away. Daniel felt something stir inside him. His hands trembled slightly as he rose to his feet. He asked, "May I say something quietly?" All eyes turned toward him, a stranger, scarred and soft-spoken. He stepped forward, the lantern in his hands, its small flame steady. He said, "I know what it's like to lose everything and blame everyone. I know what it's like to believe forgiveness is too costly to give." The room was still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "But I also know this. The moment you forgive, the weight begins to lift. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough for grace to find its way back in." He placed the lantern at the foot of the altar. He said, "This light isn't mine. It's borrowed from someone who chose mercy instead of hate. And every time it burns, it reminds me we are never too far gone to begin again." No one moved for a long moment. Then slowly, an elderly woman began to cry. A man behind her reached forward, laying a hand on her shoulder. Something shifted in the air, subtle, invisible, but real. Father Jonah stepped forward, his voice thick. "Let this be our beginning." And for the first time in months, the people of Lindenbrook prayed together. In the days that followed, change came not in miracles but in moments. Neighbors began sharing tools again. The baker offered bread to the farmers who once accused him of hoarding. Children laughed in the streets. And every evening, as twilight painted the sky, Daniel lit his lantern at the chapel steps. Soon, others began to bring their own. Small candles, old lamps, anything that could hold a flame. By the end of the week, the chapel glowed with dozens of lights, each one a testament to forgiveness rediscovered. Father Jonah called it the Night of Grace. Daniel simply called it home. That night, as Daniel stood under the stars, he whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me see your mercy multiply." The lantern flame flickered in his hand, and he smiled, knowing that somewhere far away, another lantern still burned in a quiet valley, its light now living through him. The days after the Night of Grace were bright with quiet joy. The people of Lindenbrook began to look each other in the eyes again, and the chapel, once half empty, now filled with songs that carried through open windows and into the streets. Daniel worked among them, repairing, comforting, praying. For the first time in years, he felt a stillness inside him that wasn't fragile, but rooted, as though peace itself had taken residence in his soul. But peace, he was learning, was not the absence of storms. It was the strength to hold the lantern when the winds came again. It began one afternoon, a single shout from the northern fields. A fire had broken out in the wheatlands. By the time Daniel and the others reached the ridge, black smoke was already curling into the sky. The flames spread fast, parried by the wind that always swept the valley in late summer. Men ran with buckets, women formed a chain from the river, but the heat was unbearable, and the smoke clawed at their lungs. Daniel joined the line, his hands blistering from the pails. He worked until his arms ached, until even his vision swayed. Then, through the haze, he heard a cry, high, sharp, terrified, a child. He turned toward the sound and saw her, a little girl trapped beyond the fence line, the flames closing in. Without a word, Daniel dropped the bucket and ran. He reached her just as a beam collapsed nearby, showering them with sparks. He wrapped his coat around her, shielding her face, and carried her through the smoke, stumbling toward the riverbank. By the time he reached safety, his body trembled from exhaustion. The girl coughed weakly, but was alive. He smiled through the pain, but as he looked back, he saw what the fire had taken. Half the fields were gone. The crops, the town's entire season of hope, lay in ashes. And as the people watched the smoke curl into the sky, despair returned, heavier than before. That evening, the town gathered near the chapel. The faces that once glowed with hope now glimmered with anger. "We're cursed," one man shouted. "Why did this happen after we prayed?" cried another. A third spat bitterly. "All this talk of forgiveness and faith, what good did it do? The Lord took everything again." Daniel stood among them, silent, his clothes singed, his hands wrapped in bandages. Father Jonah tried to speak, to calm them, but the murmurs rose higher. They turned to Daniel then, their eyes full of accusation. "You brought this," someone said. "Ever since you came, strange things have happened." Another nodded. "Maybe you brought your sins here. Maybe we're paying for them." The words cut deep, not because Daniel believed them, but because they echoed a voice he had once fought hard to silence, the voice of shame. He lowered his head, unable to find words. That night, alone in his small room, Daniel lit his lantern, but the flames struggled, flickering weakly as if it too had grown weary. He sank to his knees. "Lord, I don't understand," he whispered. "Did I fail you? Did I bring this sorrow to them?" The silence pressed heavy against his heart. For the first time in months, he felt far from grace, as though the light he had carried so faithfully was fading from within. He thought of leaving, of disappearing into the hills before his presence caused more division. But then, through his tears, he remembered Elena's words on the morning he left her valley. "Grace travels, Daniel. Even when you can't feel it, it keeps moving." He closed his eyes, clutching the lantern close. "Even when I can't see you, help me trust that you still burn." The flame steadied, small but sure. Morning came with gray skies and quiet hearts. Daniel went to the fields again. Most had given up, saying there was nothing left to save. But he began to dig. Slowly, methodically, he turned the blackened soil with his bare hands. One by one, others came, hesitant at first, then more certain. Together, they worked the ground, clearing ash, planting again. It would take months before anything grew, but Daniel smiled faintly. "It's not over," he said softly. "It never is with God." When Sunday came, the chapel was silent. No songs, no prayers, just weary faces and hollow hearts. Daniel stepped forward, the lantern in his hands. "I almost left," he said quietly. "When the fire came and the blame followed, I thought maybe I was the reason. But then I remembered something someone once told me. Faith isn't what you feel when everything works. It's what you hold when nothing makes sense." He lifted the lantern. Its small flame glowed against the dim walls. "This light burned even when I couldn't see why it should. Maybe that's what faith is. Not answers, but endurance. And I believe that if we keep holding on, even through the ashes, God will bring new life again." The silence deepened, but this time it wasn't empty. Father Jonah rose slowly, nodding. "He will," he said. And one by one, the people stood, joining hands. Their voices rose, soft, trembling, but rising, the sound of prayer returning to the wounded town. Outside, the wind shifted. The ashes lifted from the fields, carried upward, like dark wings turning to light. And though the land was still scarred, something unseen had begun to bloom again. The stubborn, sacred beauty of faith that refuses to die. Daniel smiled faintly, whispering to the flickering lantern in his hand, "Even when the flame falters, grace does not."
Years had passed since Daniel first left the valley. The world had carried him through towns and deserts, through laughter and loss, through seasons of harvest and famine. Wherever he went, he worked with his hands and prayed with his heart. He never stayed long, but he always left one thing behind: a small flame, a quiet act of grace, a whisper of hope that God still moved among the broken. Yet, as all pilgrimages do, his journey began to circle home. It was late autumn when he reached the familiar bend in the road, the one that curved around the old oak and opened to the valley he once called his grave and his rebirth. The air smelled of rain and pine. The hills shimmered with golden leaves. Daniel paused at the ridge, his heart trembling like a leaf in the wind. There, nestled in the distance, stood the chapel, small, weathered, but glowing with a soft light that pulsed against the twilight sky. He smiled. The lantern still burned. When he entered the village, he saw new faces, children running through the fields, laughter echoing between the hills. The fields that had once been charred and empty now overflowed with wheat. The same river that had once raged in anger flowed calm and clear, carrying reflections of the rising stars. But some things had changed. The chapel door creaked with age. The gardens outside were neatly kept, though the flowers leaned toward the lantern light as if seeking warmth. And sitting on the chapel steps, wrapped in a shawl, her silver hair glinting beneath the lantern's glow, was Elena, older now, slower, but unmistakably radiant. When she looked up and saw him, her breath caught. "Daniel," she whispered, as if the name would vanish if spoken too loud. He smiled, tears already shining in his eyes. "I told you grace travels." She rose slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for him. They stood in silence, looking at each other, two lives intertwined by a light that had never gone out. "I prayed you would come back," she said softly. "I prayed I'd be worthy to." They both laughed through tears, the kind of laughter that comes only after long sorrow healed by time. Inside the chapel, the air carried the same peace it always had. The wooden pews gleamed faintly.
The altar was simple: a cross, a loaf of bread, and the old lantern that had burned for years. Daniel knelt before it. The glass was cracked now, but the flames still glowed steadily. "I carried your light everywhere," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "And every time I thought it would die, it didn't. It just changed hands." Elena smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's what light is meant to do. It doesn't belong to us. We only tend it for a while." They sat together long into the night, sharing stories of all that had passed, of the towns he'd visited, the people he'd prayed with, the faith that had flickered and flared and survived. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying the sound of the river like a lullaby. Then, near midnight, Elena's breath grew slower. She smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering with peace. "Daniel, if my light goes out, promise me you'll keep tending it." He took her hand, tears slipping down his face. "It won't go out. It'll just shine from somewhere higher." Her eyes closed, her last smile soft as dawn. And in that quiet moment, as her soul slipped into eternity, the lantern beside her flared brighter than it ever had before, then steadied, serene and golden. At sunrise, Daniel placed the lantern at the chapel window, where it could catch the first light of morning. He whispered, "Well done, faithful servant." The valley awoke around him, children's laughter, birdsong, the hum of new life. He smiled, feeling the warmth of both sunlight and spirit on his face. Then, as he prepared to leave once more, he did something he hadn't done before. He took nothing with him, not even the lantern. Because this time, he knew, the light didn't need carrying anymore. It was everywhere. That night, travelers passing through the valley swore they saw 2 lights burning in the chapel window, one of glass, one unseen. And those who stayed long enough to pray there said they felt it, a peace so deep it silenced even grief. They never knew the story behind it, of a widow and a man once lost to his own fire, of a faith that refused to die. But they always left changed, whispering the same words Daniel once had under the stars. Even when the flame falters, grace does not.
No matter how deep the hurt, forgiveness is where healing begins. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, so more souls can find hope in the light of grace. Thank you for watching The Widow's Light, and remember, love always triumphs through faith.